Hello dear friends, how are you? Be welcome. Thank you for joining me here. I'm Margaret Murray and today I would like to express a few quick and brief points on the horned god, the horned figure, which is more of a religious conception important in Neopaganism rather than paganisms of the past, right? The large majority of the information we have on this figure is actually quite new and a lot more important and widespread by and in Neopagan movements, particularly in Wicca, by Wicca, which leads into misconceptions of a possible pan-European horned deity our ancestors were focused on in pre-Christian belief systems, but that is not the historical case. That is not the historical truth. I've talked about some horned deity figures in the past, a long time ago, 5 years ago, I think, and it was in answer to a patron of mine at the time, and today's video is also answering a patron. It has been like so in these past months, as many of you have noticed here on YouTube, since due to a lot of new developments in my life, very good developments, worry not. Well, unfortunately, I have neglected my patrons for many months. My apologies, it could not be helped. So questions and doubts have piled up, and now I'm taking the opportunity to answer all the questions and at the same time share with the rest of the community here on YouTube. So here we go, dear friends. If you please. So the horned god with stag's antlers, a very animalistic figure of nature depicting raw and primeval sexual energy, leading the wild hunt in Britain's forests. What they don't tell you is that there's been some horned figures in several ancient pagan cultures of the past, long before we have the first vestiges of or on religious horned figures in the British Isles. The fault lies with academia due to the lack of efforts to deliver the information to the public, and then obviously when people want to learn and are eager to know, they turn to the only things that are more available to them, and that is often, unfortunately, pseudosciences, unfounded theories and misconceptions from New Age spiritualities. Many of you probably immediately think of Cernunnos, and rightly so. The conventional name given to a horned figure or representations of horned entities within Celtic studies, right? So this name only appears once in the so-called Pillar of the Boatman. I believe that's how it was translated into English. I am translating into English right now, and I think that's the name, which is a 1st century monument erected by the Nautai Parisiaci in honor of Jupiter, in the Roman province of Lutetia, now Paris. Only there does the only reference to Cernunnos as a possible deity appears, meaning the name itself only once, right? This is the context. By all accounts, it would have been an important deity or religious symbol for the peoples of ancient Gaul, very likely even from that specific area alone. But even so, lacking another name or term, this has been the name or designation for almost all horned figures that appear, especially in archaeological contexts of the Celtic cultural matrix. This is why some doubts arise when discussing the Celtic artistic figure with horns dating from the Iron Age, found engraved on the cauldron, or rather, on the silver vase from Kutenstrup in Denmark, and this figure is referred to as Cernunnos. But once again, this is the conventional name for figures of this kind. But without a doubt, a horned figure was known in many contexts throughout Europe. And although many studies only focus on the Iron Age and Celtic contexts, horned figures appear much earlier than that. There are several contexts from the Paleolithic to the Iron Age, although it is important to underline here that several indigenous entities, either deemed to be divine in nature or spirit entities of some other kind, before the religious artistic influence of Eastern Mediterranean societies, particularly those of the Hellenic cultural context and the Roman, deities before that in Europe were usually depicted as animals. Not always, but usually depicted as animals. The anthropomorphization of gods and other spirits departs from ancient Greece and by consequence also adopted by Romans. Both the horned figures in the boatman's pillar and the silver vase of Gutenshoop are inspired and influenced by Roman artistic standards, giving an anthropomorphic figure to anthropomorphic appearance to a likely older deity in animal form. Also, another important point which has been discussed here on previous videos, even though there's this academic focus on Iron Age horned figures, the truth is that by this period in history, the Iron Age in Europe, such figures were very rare in the religious context or any other context from which we have surviving evidences. The actual period that has been highly focused on horned figures was the Bronze Age, and in the areas of the Iberian Atlantic, where it is nowadays Portugal, all the way down through the Mediterranean into Greece and back and forth, with a special centralization of these figures in Sardinia, nowadays an Italian island, and also in almost the entire coast of nowadays Portugal and Galicia, right? I absolutely love these little guys, and I may one day develop just a little bit more about them. The point here is that these are not gods. This is a Bronze Age Mediterranean and Iberian Atlantic religious phenomenon of the heroicization or heroization of particular human figures, meaning it is the religious process of elevating someone or a group of persons, human persons, to a status of a hero. This is something that I've talked about before in academic studies is often a religious phenomenon quite common in ancient Greece. As I said, something I've already discussed in a previous video in my classical studies series, which is the creation of heroes, human beings who evolved from historical data, who specially protected the place where they were perhaps buried in some cases. The cult of heroes most likely already existed in Mycenaean times and derived from the cult of the dead, although there is no archaeological evidence to support this so far, and it seems to have been a later phenomenon derived from the Greek epic tradition. Therefore, we are not talking here only about people who died and were buried, and in the place where the dead are deposited, a monument is erected to the cult of that person who became a hero. We are talking about mostly, in the great majority of cases, people who have become legend, even myth, who remain in oral and literary culture and folklore tradition and are then turned into heroes long after they are dead. It evolves into commemorating heroic deeds, celebrating certain qualities, and sometimes glorifying individuals. This is usually a religious phenomenon apart from the worship of gods and goddesses, with only very, very few exceptions when some heroes indeed become gods, such is the case of Hercules. And then this is a particular religious phenomenon whose contexts are abundant in the geographical areas I've mentioned of Sardinia and Atlantic Portugal, with quite a few contexts in Western Spain as well, in Galicia, in the Bronze Age, most specifically, where we see these heroes, persons, human persons who have become heroes, but here depicted wearing horns, the horns of power. These are usually representations of human figures holding weapons, and it evolves into stelae, memory stones, right, if you will, monuments to the dead, where these horned heroes are also represented with other paraphernalia on them and around them as well, like other weapons, shields, and even their war chariots. These are not ordinary humans. These were warriors and probably with high social status in their society. We are most likely talking about war chiefs, war chieftains, leaders, kings, noblemen from a warrior caste. And then these progressively evolve into monuments that become ever more anthropomorphized, right? The stone itself, it's depicted with a human shape, and progressively they lose the horns until in the northern Portuguese and Galician areas they become what is known as the Galician-Lusitanian warriors, the final stages of the cult of heroes, represented as statues well into the early and late Western Iberian Iron Age, with their weapons and torques and arm rings, which we call virias. By the arm rings and the torques, we know these were no ordinary warriors, no ordinary people. These were chieftains, noblemen, and kings. They progressively lose the horns, possibly due to the new artistic representations as statues to avoid the easy destruction of these monuments by not creating points of tension, right, in the statues themselves, because we are still talking about, at this time, we are still talking about indigenous animistic context, right? In the belief that the statue represents the warrior himself, surely, and his spirit inhabits his own statue. That's why the statue was created in the first place. Therefore, as a guardian of the settlement and towns and cities, the destruction of the statue is the death or or departing of the hero's protective spirit. It is no coincidence that the Romans destroyed so many of these statues throughout the more than 200 years of war against these cultural groups. Therefore, we have two important points here, right? Natural and divine powers represented by power animals whose horns or antlers symbolize virility and masculinity among the warrior caste, which are later anthropomorphized, and the cult of the hero with horns of power, war horns, and his status as a war chief, which will later influence Celtic and Celticized cultures that absorb these religious and cultural concepts of a warlike matrix and masculine power linked to war and combat, eventually giving rise to horned figures and gods that will later be seen throughout continental Europe in the Iron Age, right? And when we see the horned god in Neopagan belief systems, especially within Wicca, of course, it actually has nothing to do with all these Bronze Age and Iron Age historical events and contexts and cultural religious phenomena, but several misconceptions and misinterpretations and suppositions that led to the creation of a horned deity within Neopaganism. And the horned god became the male deity most worshipped as one of the main pantheon figures by many modern pagans since the 20th century, as a figure linked to the wild woods, fertility and masculinity, as this personification of animal energy representing the primal animal within us all, showing how we are still connected to the natural world and our wild selves. And I see nothing wrong with it, mind you. But the problem here is that it led to several misconceptions leading to the belief on a pan-European horned god named Cernunnos, whom now modern pagans worshipped as some ancestral divine figure, when in fact the historical contexts are quite different and were barely taken into consideration. In most cases, they were not taken into consideration at all. And on top of that, Cernunnos is this horned deity many Wiccans see as a god from the British Isles, when the historical contexts from which this modern figure was influenced by are actually from continental Europe, mostly contexts of the Mediterranean and Iberian Atlantic, Bronze Age and Iron Age contexts of nowadays France and Denmark. There are, in fact, several representations of horned figures, be those animals or humans, in several contexts from the European continental Paleolithic to the Iron Age. And of course, obviously, there's that very famous sorcerer, a cave painting found in the cave of the Trois Frères Ariège in France, which is a very, very unusual artistic depiction for the Upper Paleolithic, but it's there, right? And these are the figures that led to a lot of suppositions and misconceptions, and no small amount of inventions that eventually led to the belief of a pan-European horned god. But this was not Neopagans' fault and the fault of Wicca alone. This was, in fact, in great part, Margaret Murray's fault. I've talked about this in the video I've made about the witch cult or the witch religion. And if you have the time, please do watch that video so I don't have to, once again, repeat what most of you have already heard. Have already heard me saying, if this is not the first time you hear me speaking about this, of course. But very quickly, Margaret Murray theorized that there had been a prehistorical witch religion, and if you come to read her academic work on it, which I think you should, at the time, which has since been totally debunked, mind you, you will notice makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but she created this theory that it was very appealing at the time of a witch religion where each coven had exactly 13 members and was led by a master, a person considered a god incarnate by the witches and had to be obeyed in all things, and also instructed witches in the performance of magical performances and rituals. Fast forward, and not wanting to bore you with, or by repeating what I said in previous videos, basically Margaret Murray concluded that the leader of this coven was male, would conduct the religious services observed by the witches' Sabbath, or on the witches' Sabbath, sorry, and often led his colleagues into fertility dances. He would dress himself as a horned figure or present itself as a horned figure, right? She later developed a little bit more on this as the figure that gave rise to the worship of a horned deity, which she theorized to either be Cernunnos or Pan, at the center of witch worship. So all manner of horned creatures and entities were seen as the manifestation of this deified master of witches in an ancient witch religion, and that includes Cernunnos, Pan, the Minotaur, Herne the Hunter, Nagimesha, and so on and so forth. And this is in the origins of the very figure whom the Christians called the devil. A lot of theories and suppositions. It's a total mess that ruined her career as an academic because her previous work on Egyptology is sound and quite good. However, her entire studies on the witch religion she invented is absolutely terrible, but it was quite popular at the time and gave rise to even more theories and finding patterns where there are none, because what she talked about never actually existed and there are no evidences for it. She highly misinterpreted witch trials and tried to forcibly connect everything to a horned figure by picking contexts that have absolutely nothing to do with all of this, and trying to forcibly connect them into creating this sort of pan-European god of witches, right? And of course, at the time, this being quite popular, and she was known as a sound, proper academic figure given her previous works, this was taken at face value at the time and was quite popular among modern occultists and Neopagans, influencing figures such as Gerald Gardner into creating modern Wicca and including this supposed horned god within the beliefs of Wicca, which further popularized this figure and led to even more misconceptions and and misunderstandings concerning horned figures. Something that I have also talked about in a previous video. And if you would be so kind, please do watch those videos where I delve more deeply into these studies. The point being, Gerald Gardner was highly influenced by Margaret Murray's witch cult hypothesis. Gerald Gardner, one of the most influential voices in modern Wicca. You see, the big problem here is that one influential figure in the academic field makes something up. It is believed because it is an influential figure and believed to be academically sound, and then other studies and theories arise to keep on following these previous ideas. And academics, scholars, and non-academics as well, contemporary to Murray, saw themselves in a position of trying to forcibly find evidences that supports her theory because she was believed to be right. And so it happens that people, well, forcibly connected things that had absolutely no connection just to keep in line with what she invented. And obviously that's when people started to question things because it was all too forceful. And the evidences did not add up after all, at all. So several problems with the witch cult hypothesis and other early studies of comparative anthropology soon emerged, right? Fieldwork, actual fieldwork and discussions with people living in the cultures, Margaret Murray, Gerald Gardner, before that George Fraser's work, The Golden Bough, which influenced Margaret Murray's work, Robert Graves' The White Goddess, and so on and so forth. Through several studies, people came to realize that they all often had misunderstood these beliefs and contexts. By the way, these are all names I've spoken about in that previously mentioned video about the witch religion. George Fraser and Margaret Murray cherry-picked contexts and evidences to fit their preconceived notions of what they thought they would find and what they wanted to find. And all these misunderstandings, unfounded theories, suppositions and inventions greatly influenced figures of Neopaganism, especially figures connected to Wicca, the most famous New Age Neopagan religion, giving rise to this horned god as a supposed pan-European pagan god of old, which just isn't true, as poetic as it may sound. But well, be that as it may, the horned god gained life of its own and became an important religious figure within modern Wicca. Wicca is a dualistic tradition that reveres the horned god as a counterpart of the goddess, and the festivals of the wheel of the year represent the flowing relationship of these two deities. The god is believed to be born at the Yule period, the winter solstice, and not the original pagan Yule time. He impregnates the fertile goddess at Bautania by performing the great rite, and dies at either Lammas, Mabon, the autumn equinox, or Samhain, depending on personal beliefs. The idea of the cyclical birth and death of the god forms the foundation of the wheel of the year and gives the central ideas of rebirth and renewal to the Wiccan calendar, right? Some split the god into two aspects, the Holly and Oak kings, representing the dark and light halves of the year. The Oak king conquers the Holly king at Yule and reigns until Litha, the summer solstice, when the Holly king defeats him in return. There are at least 4 types of god, representation of God in Wicca: vegetation god, solar deity, and sacrificed god, with the horned god being the most widely revered. The several variants, there are other variants of the god, are amalgamated into the figure of the horned god, And he's sometimes conflated with the Green Man, while others see these as different beings entirely, right? For many modern pagans, especially for Wiccans, the god Cernunnos is the embodiment of the horned god. As I said, while his name is only mentioned on the pillar of the boatman in the first century of the Common Era, the image of him as a cross-legged figure with stag's horns is widespread, with the most famous depiction, of course, appearing on the Gutenstroop cauldron I've talked previously, or as I also previously mentioned. And many still believe to this day he was worshipped across much of Europe in the Gallo-Roman period as a god of fertility, animals, and the underworld. I mean, it's a beautiful and poetic idea, very in line with the modern mentality and principle, especially in an era where environmental activism is an important part of the ethics of modern paganism. But you and I know now best. we now know best concerning the horned figures of the past and this new horned god of Wicca. But well, the horned god became far more important in Wicca in England for obvious reasons, thanks to Murray and Gardner and so on and so forth, and by consequence also important in Wicca in the US. So many in England see the horned god as Herne, or Herne, a god of the wild hunt, of which I have spoken of in that previous video from 5 years ago, being the earliest mention of Herne in Shakespeare, actually, a spirit that haunts Windsor Forest, and some say in the form of a stag. Later it was said that he was the ghost of an Elizabethan forest keeper who hung himself. But today, no doubt, Herne is seen as a manifestation of the horned god and equated with Cernunnos. It's funny how things change and evolve into something else entirely. And were it not for the work of researchers, historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists, people would believe anything to be super ancestral and ancient, because we humans, if we do not record things, we live from mill to mill and forget about practically anything else, because we are mostly on survival mode still. Well, my dear friends, I do hope you have come to enjoy this video, and most importantly, may it be useful to you somehow. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.